Okay, so before we jump over into Houdini and actually start making our shader, which will take use of HDRI information for lighting and shading purposes, it'd be pretty useful to discuss, well, what is HDRI and what is a fairly standard workflow for creating an HDRI for use in CG. So to do that, we really need to look at the problem that HDRI was developed to tackle, and that problem is that we want to put a CG element, some form of CG object, into a live action plate. So we've gone out and we have filmed using a film camera. It could be film, digital, it doesn't matter. We've gone out though and acquired some footage using a camera, and that is our live action plate. And we now, on the computer, have a CG element, be that a character, be that a set extension, that we want to put into that live action plate. We want it to look like it belongs in that live action plate. So to do that, we actually need it to look as if it was there on set when we were truly filming it, and that it was being filmed with the same camera at the same time, under the same lighting as the set. And there are really multiple sub-problems to this. We need to look at camera tracking, because we'd need to take the camera, the real-world camera, we'd need to match its movement on the computer so that the movement of our virtual camera is identical to the movement of the real-world camera. We'd need to match the quality of the film, the aesthetic properties of the film, be that film grain, be that certain coloration information. We'd need to match that quality of the film. But perhaps the most important, and certainly the area that this DVD is going to be focusing on, is an area which we can refer to as light matching, and that is that the CG object needs to look as if it was lit by the lighting that was actually on set when we filmed the backplate. So that's the area that we're going to be focusing on in this DVD, and that's actually the area that HDRI was developed to tackle. So let's take a look at why light matching is important, and to do that I'm going to load in some images. So let's say that we have our classic teapot, and here is our teapot, and we want to integrate that teapot into a live action backplate. So where is our backplate? Here's our backplate. And we want to take that teapot and we wanted it to look as if it was truly sat on that backplate, or rather in that set when we filmed the backplate. There shouldn't be, at the end of this process, there shouldn't be the idea of a separate CG teapot and live action backplate. It should simply look like a single image that was filmed with one camera. That is the end goal that we're going for. And we can see that if we just took the teapot as we have it currently, which is this guy here with some rather default lighting, and we were to simply layer that over the top of our backplate, we get a very bad light match. And what do I mean by a bad light match? Well, we can analyze the lighting information on the backplate, and we can analyze the lighting information on the teapot, and we can see that these two sets of information don't align. They aren't the same, if you will, because if we look at our set, we have a bright light source coming from the left of our frame. It's also coming from the background of our frame, in from the left to the right, and we can see that our teapot is really lit from where the camera is. We don't have a strong sense of lighting on the left hand side of this teapot. It's simply lit from face on from where the camera is. So the lighting on the teapot does not reflect the lighting on every other object in the scene, and therefore if I was to show this image to someone and ask them to point out which element wasn't truly there, which element is CG, I could pretty much guarantee that everyone would be able to spot the teapot as being CG. So if we want this teapot to match with the backplate, we're going to need to match the lighting along with a number of other things, but the lighting will get us a lot closer to having a believable teapot in this backplate. So let's take a look at what we'd get if we did match the lighting. Now obviously this teapot still looks CG. There are a number of other elements that are required for fooling the viewer into believing that it's not CG, but primarily we're looking at the lighting and shading here, and we can see that the lighting on this object is much more believable than the lighting on our earlier teapot. If we take a look at our earlier teapot with its default lighting not corresponding to the direction of the lighting in the scene, and then take a look at our new teapot that is utilizing lighting from the scene, you can see that we have the strong light from the left is illuminating the left-hand side of this teapot. We can see there it's represented on all of the other objects in the scene, so it's sharing the same illumination, the same light environment as every other object in the scene. There's also a reflection of another light source that's coming from the right hand side of the screen. It's off camera, but that light source is there, and that's an important fact. The fact that other objects in the scene, like this spanner here, are picking up on the light source that's off camera, so our object needs to pick up on those light sources as well. So if our object is being rendered using the same lighting that was actually existent on set, that means that we're going to be able to match the lighting on our object to the lighting on any other object in the scene, and that's going to give us a much stronger, a much better integration of our CG element into the scene. And we've already discussed there the problem, if you will, and the solution at the same time. The problem is that we need a good light match, and the solution is, to get a good light match, we need to match the lighting that was existent on set. So what if we could go out onto set and actually capture the lighting information that was on set and bring that back onto the computer? So let me just close out these guys for a second. So what if we went out onto set and captured the lighting information? Well, you may say to me, well, to capture lighting information, can't we just take a photo? So let's take a look at a photo of our set. Now this is a standard dynamic range image. This is a photo, as most people, especially a digital image, as most people are familiar with. It's basically consisting of 8 bits per color channel. We'll discuss exactly what that means shortly, but it's a single image. We can see it's just a JPEG, and in this image we have information about our set. But that information is fairly lacking. I mean, all pixels over a certain brightness are just white. All of this area is white, but we should know from the real world that the sky isn't a value of white. The sky may have clouds, it may be blue sky, it's certainly not a value of white, yet in this standard dynamic range representation, the sky is a value of white, and that's because all pixels that are over a certain brightness get overexposed, and they simply get reflected as a white value in the image. On the other end of the scale, all pixels under a certain brightness, for example, all of this area of the tire, we know on the tire that they're not the same color. There's information, there's subtle lighting information, but we're just seeing a single black value here because all pixels under a certain brightness get clamped off and they get given a value of black, a value of 0 in each of the 3 color channels. And that's truly the limitation of a standard dynamic range image. It simply represents a single exposure. It represents the color information that we are seeing through the camera at a given exposure, and that only gives us a small fraction of the true information about the lighting. So we don't want to represent what colors we saw at a given exposure. We want to represent what the lighting is doing in the scene, and to do that we need to change how we think about our pixels. Our pixels no longer need to represent color, they need to represent an intensity value, an intensity of light for that pixel that was reaching the camera. So as we mentioned a second ago, this standard dynamic range image is an 8-bit image. That means we have 8 bits of information for red, 8 bits of information for blue, 8 bits of information for green. That's 256 tones in each of these. And the granularity of these divisions just simply don't allow for representing the broad range of light intensities in any given scene. We know this, we can see this because we're getting overexposure and underexposure, areas that are going above what we could represent with those 256 tones, and areas that go below what we can represent with those 256 tones. So if we're using an 8-bit image, an integer image, we are basically running out of values that we can represent. We have a single exposure range that we can represent in terms of color. So we actually need to use a floating point image, because a floating point image isn't restricted to this idea of a range of 256 tones for red, for green, for blue, but rather each pixel is assigned a floating point value for red, a floating point value for green, and a floating point value for blue, and each of those can represent a infinitely small value all the way up to a very large value. And because of that, we can represent all of the range of the lighting in our scene. So let's load in a floating point image. And this floating point image is an HDRI image, high dynamic range, because of the fact that it's utilizing floating point information. And it's actually a panorama. We'll come back and talk about that in a second. But for now, let's just take a look at the fact that it's an HDRI. And what does that mean? Well, our monitor is still a standard dynamic range display device. We have a limited range, and we can still see in this image that lighting information above a certain point is given a white color, and lighting information below a certain point would be given a black color. But what's interesting here is that our monitor is just displaying to us an exposure, if you will, of this image. This image actually doesn't contain color information per se, but rather we could think of it as containing lighting information, intensity of light reaching a specific pixel. And because of that, we can change the exposure of the image. I can drop our exposure down and reveal information in those previously overexposed areas that in a standard dynamic range image we simply couldn't see, because this is containing lighting information. And much as when light in the real world reaches our camera and we have a certain exposure that will determine the color we get, well, light in this image is reaching I guess you could think of it as reaching the screen, and we're determining what color we want to display to represent that light information based on our exposure. So you can see as we decrease our exposure, we're cutting out the light that we're seeing, and that gives us information in those very bright areas. Or as we increase our exposure, those areas get overexposed, but now areas that were previously in shadow are being brought out of shadow, and information about those really dark areas is being revealed to us. So you can see by using an HDRI, we now have information about all of the lighting on the set, not information about color at a given exposure. So the idea of using a floating point image, the idea of using a high dynamic range image is essential, because we wanted to go out on set and we wanted to capture lighting information, not color information. So now that we've got that lighting information, let's turn around and discuss some more properties of this image. So notice that this image is not a standard image that we'd expect to see through a camera, as we discussed when we first loaded this image. It's a very distorted view, and this distortion is not by coincidence, it's actually by design. Because if we think at the problem at hand, we're trying to capture information about lighting on our set, and that lighting information is in 3D, and we need to somehow represent that in a way that's easy to store and easy to access when we bring it back onto a computer. And capturing information in terms of 3D lighting, it's actually quite complicated. It would be a very hard set of information to store. So if we make some simplifications to the actual information we're capturing, then we can store it in a 2D image, because we know a 2D image is very easy to store, very easy to access with an X and Y coordinate into the image. And by simplifying the information and storing it in a particular way, we get an image that's going to look like this. So what simplification are we going to make? Well, instead of capturing all of the lighting information in our scene, what if we just deal with a single point in our scene? Because if we have a single point in our scene, we know that lighting information hitting that point is coming from different directions. So there's the light hitting our point. It's coming from all different directions. And we could make a mapping where the direction of light hitting the point, so the direction vector, is going to map to a specific pixel in our 2D image. So here's our 2D image. And we could say that a specific direction, for example, let's say this guy, maps to a specific pixel, and when we look at a different direction, that's going to map to a different pixel in our image. That means that by picking on a specific pixel in the image, let's jump over back to our HDRI. So let's say I pick on this pixel right here. I know by the very nature of where that pixel is in our 2D image, I know the direction the light was traveling in when it hit that point in space, and I also know the intensity of that light because that intensity is the value that's stored in our image for that pixel. So that means that this image is a map, if you will, of light intensities for all the different directions reaching that point in space. And that may sound like a very complicated mapping to put in place, but it's actually very simple. This is a latitude-longitude mapping. And latitude-longitude is something that hopefully a lot of you are familiar with, not necessarily from CG, but simply from the real world, where we're dealing with measuring a position on the Earth's surface. Because if we've got our Earth, so here is a really crude representation of our Earth, we know that a position on the Earth can be determined in terms of a rotation about the poles of our Earth. Now obviously our Earth's axis is actually at a slight angle. For simplification, I'm making it perfectly vertical. So we know that we have a rotation around the axis that runs from north to south pole. So we could imagine this rotation being our equator, and we have a certain angle that we'd need to rotate in, and that is our longitude. And once we've rotated in that angle, we then can rotate up or down, so north or south, from that point a certain angle to reach the point we're interested in, and that second rotation is our latitude. So we've taken a position, if you will, a position in space on our sphere, and we've used polar coordinates to get access to that position on the surface of the sphere. And to do that, what we've used are two angles. We've used a longitude angle, that's this guy right here, and we've used a latitude angle, that's the north-south rotation right there. So we've got those two angles, and to use those two angles we can now access a point on our sphere. If we were to take a look at how this corresponds to our direction of light from a single point, here's our point. Imagine having a sphere around it. Now imagine that light hitting that point from a specific direction is going to intersect our sphere at a specific point, because that light comes down, intersects our sphere, and then hits the point in the center. So if we were to take the latitude and longitude of that intersection with the sphere, that knowing that we have the center position of our point in the center of our sphere, the latitude and longitude of this point gives us the direction of light from that point to the center of the sphere. And latitude and longitude, being two values, very nicely map into x and y in our image. So the longitude, the east to west rotation, if you will, maps to the x-axis of our image. And as we move from one side, from the very left side to the very right side of our image, as we take a look over here, we're rotating through 360 degrees around our sphere. So when we're on the very left-hand side, light is hitting us from one side of the set. And as we move from left to right, we're rotating around the equator, and light is hitting us from a different direction in the set, until we reach the very right-hand side, where we're back around to the same position as the left-hand side. So we've rotated through 360 degrees around our sphere, and we have captured the lighting information hitting us from a number of angles through that 360 degrees range. The y coordinate, as we move up and down our image, represents the latitude. It represents the rotation north or south, up off of the equator, to again specify a position on the sphere, which again, by specifying a position on the sphere, we're specifying the direction of light reaching that point. So as we move north and south in our image, as we move in y, we are rotating up towards the ceiling. So here, light hitting us is coming from upwards. It's coming from the roof of our set and hitting that point. Or as we move down, the light is coming from below. It's hitting a single point in space, but it's coming from the floor of the set. So now when we use an XY value within this image, we know that that XY value corresponds to certain rotations about a point in space, and that means I know for a given position in space that a certain intensity of light was coming from a certain angle and hitting that position in space, all because of the fact that we're dealing with a latitude longitude map. So just very briefly to kind of recap, I guess, if you will, when we're dealing with X, we're dealing here with a 360 degrees rotation. So if we imagine this being 0, as we move from the very left to the very right, we're rotating through 360 degrees in longitude around the equator of our Earth. As we move from the top to the bottom, that's 180 degrees that we're rotating through. We're going from facing all the way up, pointing directly up at the sky, all the way down to pointing directly down at that ground. And with this image now, we've now captured the light hitting a single point in space from every single direction, obviously based on the resolution of our image, but we can imagine it being from every single direction. And that gives us a lot of information about our lighting. But as we mentioned a minute ago, we're dealing with a single point in space now. We're not dealing with the true lighting information on our set. We're only dealing with the lighting information that was reaching a single point on our set. And you may think that this approximation of the light that's truly existent in a 3D environment down to the light reaching a single point just isn't going to be accurate enough for our needs. However, as long as the point that we choose to represent is roughly in the location of the CG object that we're going to be lighting, that we want to integrate into the backplate, then we can actually quite easily trick the viewer into believing the lighting, and that's because the viewer only sees a 2D representation of the set. So let's actually grab back this guy. Here we go. So you can see that the viewer doesn't know about the 3D lighting on the set because the viewer is only ever shown what we show them. They are shown a 2D image as the camera saw our set. And because they're only shown a 2D image, they can't acquire all of the necessary information to prove whether the lighting on our CG object is 100% accurate or not. As long as the directions are roughly accurate, they're going to believe the lighting. Their brain is going to trick them into believing that that image is fine. There's nothing wrong with that image. And so as long as our point in space was roughly around where this teapot is, then the light information that was hitting that point, if we then generalize and say, well, the direction of lighting hitting that point was the direction of lighting hitting any point in this general area, and we use that for our lighting, it's going to trick the viewer. The viewer is going to believe that the lighting they're seeing is correct because of the fact that the direction of the lighting overall is correct for our scene. The very slight positional differences we get aren't correct, but the idea of light being very strong coming in from the left and hitting this side of our object, well, that's the same whether we measured the light from this point or a point over here or a point up here. And the idea of light coming in from off camera and hitting this side of the object as it is other objects in our scene, again, is correct, even if our position is slightly offset. So as long as the general lighting direction approximately matches the lighting that's in our set, that's all that we need to trick the viewer into believing the lighting that's hitting our object. So that's a look at HDRI, how we'd go about mapping direction of lighting into a 2D image. But how do we create that image? How do we go about generating an HDRI that looks something like this? Well, much of the workflow still used today for generating HDRI panoramas, also referred to as light domes, for use in image-based lighting, comes from the workflows and the techniques that were presented by a man named Paul Debevec. And he presented these ideas, these workflows, these techniques as SIGGRAPH publications, SIGGRAPH courses, etc. And there's a lot of information on his website. So if you were to head over to debevec.org, you can check out all of the information that he has put up on his website. There's a lot of good information about HDRI and about capturing light domes available on this website. And we know that we need to capture the light reaching a single point. And I'm just going to close out all of the, well, not my whiteboard, but all of the other images we had open. Fantastic. So we know we want to capture the light reaching a single point. And to do this, we can put a chrome sphere in our set out on the set where the true background plate is being filmed. So let's take a look at what that might look like. So there's our chrome sphere on set. And the center of the sphere, so the very central point of that sphere, represents the single point in space that we're going to be capturing the lighting information for. And the light that is getting reflected off of our sphere represents the light that is reaching that single point in space. So if we take a photograph of that sphere, we're actually capturing the light information that is reaching that point in space. Now, before we move on and continue to discuss this area, I do want to point out that when you're taking photographs out on set of a chrome sphere like this, if you have the ability to, please use the Canon RAW format. That's a format supported by Canon cameras that allows for taking an image where the image will not manipulate any of the colors or the light information that it captures. And that means that we have a very useful image that tells us truly the lighting that it captured at that exposure out on set. Whereas if you weren't to use this format and you were to use some other format and captured the lighting information on set, it may have applied some processing to the image which would have manipulated the colors, maybe changed the white balance, maybe changed the colors, and that would result in information that doesn't truly represent the information that was there on set. And so by using the RAW format, it's going to make our life a lot easier because we've got a more accurate representation of the lighting information that was there on set. So we've gone away and we've taken this photograph of our chrome sphere, but there are still some issues. Firstly, the central portion of the latitude-longitude map that we'd get from this image is actually given far more pixel area than the extremities. We can actually get information about the 360 degrees around this sphere and the 180 degrees up and down this sphere simply by unwrapping this sphere. But if we look at it, this central portion has a large area of pixels. This side, even though we're going through a huge range of angles here, all the way through the 360 degrees, but only this is a very small portion of the degrees and this is a very large portion of the degrees, they're given very few pixels. And if we were to unwrap this, we'd have heavy distortion around the edge. And we can take a look, if we were to take that image and unwrap it, look at the heavy distortion we're getting at the edges. Really only this central portion of the image is usable for us because these edges are just too heavily distorted. So we've got an issue with the proportion of our latitude-longitude map in comparison to the information we've captured in the image. We're also still only taking a standard dynamic range image. This doesn't have all the lighting information we need. It simply has the color at a given exposure. And also we can see we've got a cameraman in our photo, which is going to be a little problematic. And just to sort of do a shout out, I guess, to this guy, this cameraman is actually a close friend of mine named Oliver Hunt, who helped me out on my project with capturing the light dome that I used on my project. So just a quick shout out to Ollie. Thanks again for your help. He's a great guy. So anyway, back on to our lecture, we need to deal with these three issues. The issue of the proportions of our latitude-longitude given by this sphere. We also need to deal with the fact that it's a standard dynamic range image. And we need to deal with the fact that Mr. Ollie is in our photograph. So let's deal with the standard dynamic range image issue first. So to generate an HDR image, a high dynamic range image, we need to know not about color, but about light intensities. and we need to know basically about the light that's reaching the least illuminated parts of our scene, or of our sphere. So we need to know about the shadows, the darkest darks, what is the light information in those areas. And we need to know about the light that's coming from the brightest light sources in our scene and reaching our sphere. For example, the sky. On both of these portions of our set, the light that's coming from those and reaching our sphere, we need to know about their light information as well. So we've already discussed the fact that a standard dynamic range image simply cannot represent this information. It doesn't have the ability to represent such a range from light to dark. However, if we were to take multiple photos, multiple standard dynamic range photos, but varying their exposures, then that series of images taken together represents the full range of images. So let's just open up this guy. So we can see that by varying our exposure over a number of photos, we now, as this set of images, have the lighting information of our set, because we can see, or a very low exposure, thus any light information in that image is of a very bright intensity. We can also see that it's a bright intensity of blue for our sky. As we increase our exposure, these guys get overexposed, but some of the areas that were underexposed, we can now turn and work out what their lighting information is, seeing that actually it would be a very, very, very dark brown light color that's coming from these shadowed areas of our image. So we have this range of exposures. Now, it's worth noting that to vary the exposure when we're taking these images, I actually varied the shutter speed of the camera, and that modifies the amount of light that's allowed into the camera. It's changing the amount of time between opening and closing the shutter, so how much light is obviously proportional to the amount of time that's open. And it's not going to affect other properties other than the amount of light, unlike changing the f-stop. You often hear of these exposures referred to in terms of f-stops, changing the f-stop of the camera, but if we change the f-stop, we're modifying the aperture, and that's not only affecting the amount of light coming in, but it's also going to affect our depth of field, and we don't really want to do that. We only want to change the light that's being allowed to reach our camera, because of the fact that we only want to be dealing with working out the lighting information in our scene. If other aspects of the images change, that's going to throw off the calculations that we perform on them. For example, we also don't want to have any primary content change in this range of images. If in one image I had a person standing here and in the next image I didn't, when we come to compare these images to try and calculate a light intensity, that discrepancy of having a person in one and not in another is going to throw those calculations. So the only thing that should be varying in those photos is the amount of light that is allowed to reach the film of the camera. And in order to ensure that, if you change the shutter speed rather than change the f-stops on your camera, that is the truest way of only allowing differing amounts of light to reach the film, as opposed to manipulating other photographic properties of the camera. So back to looking at this image sequence, we can see that we have a series of images, and through some clever processing we can actually convert these into a single HDR image. Now, those calculations are really, too complicated to discuss here, but what's nice is if we were to grab HDR Shop, head over to www.hdrshop.com. There's a free version of HDR Shop version 1, or if you like HDR Shop and want to make use of some of the later features, then go ahead and purchase version 2. But HDR Shop provides all of those calculations, all of that functionality, and actually a lot more functionality for combining a set of images into a single HDR. So I used HDR Shop to take these images and combine them into a single HDR. So if you look at our HDR, we zoom in, there we go, we can see that we no longer have a set of SDR images, we have a single HDR that's telling us the lighting information from this particular camera's location in the scene. And that's giving us information, if we were to unwrap this, about the lighting information in our latitude-longitude map in terms of light intensities rather than color, because we have the HDR image. So this is very useful to us, but we still need to deal with the other aspects, the other problems, if you will, of having a single image. It's also worth throwing out that some newer, more expensive cameras can actually take the entire range of images in series. So it will, if you had your camera on a tripod and you tell it to take this range, it would go ahead and take the 16 or 12 or 15 or however many images you want in terms of varying the exposure for each image, and then it will actually combine those down into an HDR image. I didn't have the luxury of such a camera, so I had to take each image individually, bring them back onto the computer and combine them into an HDR using HDR Shop. But what about the distortion, and what about the cameraman? Well, we can't just take a single image and hope to use that to generate our HDR panorama. What we need to do is bring up a new layer. There we go. What we need to do is take images from varying angles around our chrome sphere. So here's our chrome sphere in the set. Let's imagine that this was the first image we take, and I'm going to say that's at 0 degrees. Well, if we were to vary these angles, so let's take another image from, let's say, 60 degrees, and then another image from 120 degrees. And I'm saying image, but obviously I'm either referring to the camera's ability to take a single HDR image, or we're taking an entire exposure run, a series of images representing the exposure for, or a variety of exposures at that angle. So 0 degrees, 60, 120, 180, 240, and 300 degrees. So we could take images at each of these different angles. Now it's worth pointing out that you really want to keep a set distance, a set radius from the chrome sphere, from our dome, to ensure that we get the same properties in our image, because we want to make sure that the chrome sphere takes up the same proportion of the image, the depth of field, the field of view, all of those properties are the same from position to position. And by creating these images at fixed intervals, so here I'm going through 60 degrees increments, that just helps us with stitching, because we know that the clear areas of the image are going to, basically in this case, we're going to have them at sixths. So 1/6 of the image will come from one position, 1/6 from another position, and so on. So once we have all of these different positions, we'd have a set of HDRIs that looks something like this. So we've got our 6 different positions around the sphere. We can see from the reflections of our set that we are indeed rotating around the sphere, and each of these is an HDRI image giving us the lighting information reaching our sphere. And each of these, when we unwrap them, gives us a latitude-longitude image that represents the full 360 degrees around our set. So each of these is representing the same latitude-longitude, if you will, in terms of it's representing that same point in space, and it's representing all 360 degrees in longitude and 180 degrees in latitude for that point in space. However, the difference between the different images is that the area that's got the most detail, the least distortion, is different in each image. So if we were to take each of these images now and were to combine them into a single panorama, by cutting out the area that was clearest from one image, layering it over another image, getting it into position, and then fading between images, cloning using the clone tool in Photoshop parts of the image, we can combine these into a single panorama. And that deals with getting rid of the distortion artifacts that we're getting in certain places in the image. But it also means that we can paint out our cameraman in the image. And the final result, once we've gone through and done all of this, is that we're going to get a single panorama where we don't have any areas that are more distorted than other areas in the image, and we don't have a cameraman in our image. And that's now the final HDRI panorama, if you will, that we're going to take and use for the lighting information in CG. Now, we can take each of these basically images of the chrome sphere and unwrap them and combine them as we've discussed here, but a more expensive setup could use a fisheye lens. where you'd have a camera on a fixed position on a tripod that would rotate as opposed to rotating around and taking a photo of a sphere, and the fisheye lens would give us that large angle of information, large field of view of our set. That would remove the need to paint out a cameraman, because the cameraman wouldn't be visible in the reflection in the sphere, but it would still suffer from distortion at the edges, so you still have to take multiple angles and stitch them into a panorama. So this is the final panorama that we got from going out onto set, taking the range of images that we needed, combining them into HDRIs, unwrapping them into latitude, longitude maps, and then finally stitching each of those maps together into a final HDR. But we're actually not quite done with this image yet. In the following videos, when appropriate to the subject at hand, we're actually going to talk about some processing that we perform on this image. They're actually called convolution calculations. And that's going to make multiple images from this single HDR that are appropriate for the intended task at hand. And again, we'll discuss those as we move on to them. But for now, we're done generating our HDRI. So now that we have it, how are we going to use it? Well, that's what the rest of this DVD will focus on. I mean, different studios will use different methods for working with this HDRI information. Some will take this image and use it for image-based lighting, where the image is directly used, and that's what we're going to be doing. But others may take this image and sample from this image to generate a dome of CG lights, a light dome, and then they can use those lights, which are just CG lights, like creating a point or a spotlight in Houdini. They can use those lights to render their object just like they would with other CG lights, and maybe they'd use that for efficiency reasons in their pipeline, or so they have control so they can go in and manipulate the lights at hand, etc. So that's another different approach, is instead of using the image directly, they use the image to generate a light dome, and then use that dome of lights to light their object. But the desired result in both cases is always the same. We want to use this image to know now about the information of the lighting on set, the direction of the lighting on set, and use that to light our CG objects in a photoreal manner. However, it is worth noting that using an HDRI in this way does have a limitation, if you will. It does have a negative, and that's that we're only using the lighting information on set. And what do I mean by that? Well, imagine if back in our teapot example, there we go. So back in our teapot example, that I was to truly film this teapot on set. So I had my chrome teapot and I put it down on set and I was going to film it. Well, the director of photography would probably have placed additional lights on the set to illuminate that teapot, because the lighting that was already on set to illuminate everything else may not have been appropriate to illuminate that teapot. So on a more complicated example, let's say we had a character, chances are you may have a key and a fill light that was brought in to illuminate that character in addition to the rest of the lighting that was on set. Well, with our HDRI, we don't have that light, the additional lights that a director of photography may have put in place for creative reasons. We do get a photoreal light match, and that's all we're worried about in this DVD, so it's all we're going to be looking at in this DVD. But it's worth noting that while HDRI will get us a photoreal light match, in production HDRI is almost always going to be complemented with traditional CG lights, and that's going to allow for artistic control over the lighting in addition to the lighting required to make the viewer believe that that object existed in the scene. And I wanted to make that clear because HDRI is not there to replace the existing lighting techniques that we know and use in CG. It's there as an additional tool in our tool set at our disposal for meeting the demands of our project. So by utilizing HDRI and utilizing a shader like the shader that we develop over the next series of videos, and then combining that with CG lights for creating an additional key light to give us creative control over the lighting, then we will have the best creative control and at the same time also have a photoreal light match. But that is really an overview, and it is an overview. We haven't really gone into specifics at any single point, but it's rather an overview of how we go about getting an HDRI panorama, what this HDRI panorama actually contains in terms of lighting information on our set, and the fact that that lighting information is stored in a latitude-longitude map that means that each pixel represents a direction of light hitting a point in our scene. Now that we've overviewed a workflow for generating an HDRI and looked at what an HDRI environment map, a panorama, actually is, we can now use this HDRI and develop a shader to make use of this HDRI for photoreal lighting and shading of our CG objects. And with that, that is going to conclude this video. Thanks a lot, everyone.